What led me to want to get whales and dolphins out of captivity is really what happened after I published the study on mirror self-recognition in dolphins in 2001 with Diana Reiss. We showed that two dolphins who were living in a small concrete tank in Coney Island, Brooklyn, were self-aware. They could recognize themselves in mirrors. And that told me something about their understanding of their situation. But what happened then was that a couple of years later, both of them separately passed away from infections. And that really hit me hard. Presley and Tab were two self-aware beings living in a concrete tank in Coney Island, Brooklyn, a place where no dolphin should be living. And I started to think about my own findings, that these were self-aware beings, beings who could reflect upon themselves and their situation. And then I began to understand that this is about the fact that Presley and Tab's lives were essentially about swimming in a circle, in a dismal, broken down concrete tank where they don't belong. And that as another self-aware being, a human, I imagined what life would be like for them. And then to have them die of diseases that were preventable was, in my view, the ultimate betrayal. What I started to realize when I looked behind the scenes, behind the shows, behind all the fun of interacting with captive dolphins, is something very dark and very ugly. What I learned was that a lot of the dolphins that you go to see in shows all over the world were actually captured from the ocean, taken from their families, sometimes in horrific, bloody incidents. For instance, the Taiji drives in Japan. Up until recently, even in the United States, facilities were taking dolphins from the Taiji massacres in Japan and bringing them into captivity. Now, they don't do that anymore, but they do that around the world still. I also learned that not only the horror of where these animals came from, but also what their living conditions were like in the tanks. That these tanks were small, and that the animals were often medicated so that they can not get depressed and anxious living under these circumstances. And that all of these research superstars, these dolphins, the dolphins at Lou Herman's lab in Hawaii, the dolphins all around the world who became famous, like Presley and Tab, were gone. They had died premature deaths because of the circumstances they were living under. And that realization led me to decide that as much as I wanted to follow up the mirror study with so many other studies, I had so many research questions, I couldn't, in good conscience, go back and knowing what I knew about what these animals go through when living in tanks. In the past few years, a number of my colleagues and I have published a number of papers looking at the welfare of dolphins and whales living in marine parks and aquariums around the world. And what we found is disturbing. First of all, I can tell you that dolphins and whales do not thrive in concrete tanks. It is just not possible for an animal with its evolutionary history in the oceans, to thrive, to flourish in a marine park or an aquarium or any kind of highly artificial environment. What did we learn about their welfare? Well, three really big things. First of all, that these animals die often, and they die young, and they often die of opportunistic infections like pneumonia, yeast infections, and gastritis, etc. So what would cause a dolphin or whale living in an environment where they have veterinary care in a tank to die of pneumonia and other infectious diseases? Well, what would do that is immune system dysfunction. And what we learned is that a lot of dolphins and whales living in captivity die of diseases that indicate that their immune system is not functioning properly. We also learned that many dolphins and whales exhibit something called stereotypic behavior, meaning that they do the same behaviors, repetitive behaviors, over and over and over again, swimming in a circle, banging their body against the tank, gnawing their teeth on hard surfaces. When you see behavior like that, when you see stereotypies in anyone, any species, including humans, you know that there is some kind of psychological disturbance there. Not only that, that there is some kind of dysregulation of the brain that regulates those kinds of behaviors. And finally, what we found is that their social lives, the social lives of dolphins and whales in tanks, is largely dysfunctional. They just cannot have the kind of social complexity and the rich cultural complexity they have in the ocean, in tanks, in artificial collections of individuals. And very often, these individuals are separated. And these kinds of things cause tremendous stress, tremendous disturbance, and it's done frequently. After it became clear that I could no longer ignore what dolphins and whales endure, the suffering they endure in marine parks, I began to realize that there had to be some kind of a solution to this. And I spent a lot of time going to conferences, giving presentations, as many others have, about why these animals need to get out of the tanks. The obvious solution to this issue is sanctuary. Why? Because dolphins and whales living in tanks today cannot just be dumped back into the ocean. There's no place for them to go back to. They don't have survival skills. But what we can do is provide a natural environment for them where they can be cared for, but they can finally experience the kind of autonomy and complex environments that they can never experience in the tanks. So a few years ago, several colleagues of mine and I got together to take this idea of sanctuaries and actually make it a reality. And by doing that, what we're doing is creating an alternative to the tanks. And by doing that, we're not only helping individual dolphins and whales who can be transferred from concrete tanks to a natural environment and a sanctuary, but we're creating, in a sense, a cultural space that doesn't really exist yet. Something that people can look at as the future for how we relate to dolphins and whales. It's a way of changing our relationship with these animals and giving back to them what we've taken from them for so many decades. What we're creating in Nova Scotia is a model not just for that sanctuary, but for sanctuaries all over the world, it's really a model for a movement, not just a facility.